So, finishing out our section on identity, the self identity and social identity, particularly the theories identity theory and social identity theory. But before we get started, some quick updates. Quiz 3 is due this Friday at 11:59 p.m. Make sure to watch the supplementary videos and finish the assigned reading for this week. So, a quick review. So, the word identity carries with it a lot of meanings, especially in the social sciences. In everyday life, we use the word to mean a variety of things. Some people refer to identity as the culture of a people or who you are as a person. But these more everyday uses of the word are not particularly useful for social science research. In the social sciences, when we discuss identity, particularly in sociological social psychology, when we discuss identity, we are either referring to a common identification with a collectivity or a social category, such as with social identity theory, or we're referring to parts of the self composed of the meanings that persons attach to multiple roles they typically play in everyday life, such as with identity theory. And so, one thing that's really important to note, especially for these theories, is that they are created for a specific purpose. There's a utility for social theories. So, like theories as tools. So, you can use them as like a guiding framework. They're a way of operationalizing or conceptualizing of certain variables. Or they're designed to measure social phenomena within a very narrow scope, typically very narrow. Sometimes it's more broad, but those tend to be less precise. Whereas theories like identity theory and social identity theory are created to work well within a very narrow scope. They're looking at, of course, they're looking at different phenomena, different intergroup phenomena, um, and how the society is linked, how greater society or the social structure is linked to individuals and vice versa. But they're really looking at these very narrow understandings of identity and what that means. And they all have their specific purpose. So they're designed to answer specific questions about specific social phenomena. Um, and they can only, provide an explanation or predict behavior within very particular contexts. And while that might seem, to some of you might see that as being kind of not particularly useful, but because the social world is so complicated, we have to design very specialized tools to address these issues. Um, but when you think about it, it's really not that much different than in other areas, like let's say woodworking. I don't know, or like just every day you're doing some DIY project or whatever, and you have all these very specialized tools to address different issues. And some of those tools are more sophisticated than others. Like, sure, you have a screwdriver, um, but a drill would work a lot better. So they do the same thing, but one is much more sophisticated and advanced than the other. But they accomplish the same task. But of course, um, you couldn't use a hammer to put in a screw, right? And it wouldn't really make a lot of sense to put in a nail um, with a drill or a screwdriver. I mean, I'm sure there's ways that you can make it work, but it's just not well suited for that task. And that's kind of how social theories work too. They're designed for a specific purpose, and sometimes they don't really have a utility beyond that. Like a hammer, for example, you can use for lots of different things. You can use it to pry things, to open things, to, hammer a nail in, or to, I don't know, hammer a stake into the ground, all sorts of different uses. But, some tools like a screwdriver, again, is pretty limited in what it can accomplish. And so the purpose of identity theories, again, is to examine the self and examine the social self. We're looking at how individuals are linked to the broader society, and that's what makes it um, a theory in social psychology. And so, a discussion of the um, applications and critiques of these different theories. So, for identity theory, here again, specifically, identity refers to parts of the self composed of the meanings that persons attach to these multiple roles that they typically occupy and play in everyday life. And again, in this highly differentiated society where we all occupy various different roles and various different combinations. So, there are two specific variants of identity theory. The structural variant focuses on links between external social structure and the structure of the self. And the internal variant focuses on the internal dynamics of self processes. And so for the structural variant, a quote to remember here is that, and it's kind of a famous quote that I changed just as slightly because the original quote kind of doesn't make sense in its wording, but it essentially says that society shapes the self, which shapes social behavior. So again, going back to that foundation and individual behavior is group behavior. And then for the internal um, variant, it's important to consider the differential salience of identities and why identities change over time. It's interested in the ways in which people are tied to the social structure and the consequences these ties have for their identities, and how identity salience leads to behaviors that are tied to the roles underlying these identities. And then, of course, the nature of identities and how they operate within context um, in which they're operating, in which they're held, your immediate context. So, again, those are kind of the two variants within identity theory. Is that there is more of a structural variant and there's more of an internal variant. And then beyond that, we have social identity theory, which is related, but it's also its own thing. And so, some applications of identity theory, again, some of these can be structural, some can be internal. So, keep that in mind. One of the most common issues in identity theory research is how one's multifaceted identity, how our identities guide behavior in different situations. So, um, some example, some examples, and I put the citations here in case you're particularly interested in looking these up and learning more about them, but you certainly don't necessarily have to. But the first example is how commitment to and salience of a religious identity influenced time spent in religious activities. And another is how having concern for the environment or having, they called it an environmental identity, but seeing yourself as someone who is particularly environmentally conscious was related to actually taking action to protect the environment. So if you know a lot about how someone identifies in terms of uh, their identities, and again, this would be more structural, how does that influence their behavior when they actually go out and because they think of themselves in this way, how does that influence the likelihood of them actually going out and performing behaviors related to that identity? And then another one is it discusses identity verification of spousal identity, and so it talks about this verification of spatial identity and how it had positive effects like increased love, trust, commitment, and self esteem. And so these were actually newly married couples. And later on, they, continued this research line and found that um, identity non verification of that spousal role actually had negative consequences, such as distress. And then a pretty famous one from uh, a 1987 study um, looked at college students and how experiencing a new situation like entering college influenced the degree to which prior identities were maintained. And this is something we discussed during our last class in terms of, I believe it was like commitment, how operating within different institutions influences your level of commitment, but also the type of commitment. So, how like you attend church and you have high interactional commitment and you move away, it's going to weaken that interactional commitment because you're not operating within that institution. But you may still have, high effective commitment. And so again, here it's looking at how um, experiencing new situations and actually gaining, a new or updated or enhanced um, identity, such as college student, influences the degree to which you maintain prior identities, like maybe athlete. So you go to college and you're not going to college as a student athlete. Um, and you become much more committed to your role as a student, your social life, and maybe you start to relinquish a bit of your athlete identity. And then finally, this one was really interesting. Actually, this 2011 study, um, so it examined how moral identity influenced behavior in a situation where individuals had the opportunity to cheat or not, um, or they could perhaps not report that they were overscored on a test. And so the results revealed that those with a higher moral identity were less likely to cheat, and that individuals were more likely to report feeling bad when perceptions of who they were in the situation fell short of or exceeded their moral identity standard based on how they thought that others viewed them. So, moving on to some subfields in this area. So, I by using theory to inform other sociological areas of investigation, we're actually gathering, further insight into sociological issues and problems. We will briefly discuss how identity theory has informed some sociological areas, such as the sociology of crime and law, sociology of education, and the sociology of race and ethnicity. And so here I just put some of the kind of focuses in these areas. It's not necessarily mean that they're limited to um, these particular topics or areas of focus, but it's typically what you see in these areas and the ways in which they tend to use identity theory. And so for in the subfield in crime and law, particularly in violence research. So, violence researchers have argued that identity theory can provide an important theoretical development in domestic violence research because all behavior, including aggressive behavior, is rooted in issues of self and identity. And so, an important goal of interaction is to confirm people's identities. So, by understanding people's identities, we can identify how aggressive behavior facilitates or impedes verification of those particular identities. And one example of this is the relationship between identity verification and aggression. Researchers investigated this relationship among newly married couples. And the results showed that when people's spousal identity was not verified by the other in the marriage, it reduced their perceived level of control over their environment. So the person whose spousal identity wasn't being verified, it reduced their perceived level of control. And so, in order to compensate for this reduced control, these individuals asserted control over their spouses, and that heightened control over their spouses was associated with acts of aggression towards them. And again, this isn't like every single person responded in this way, but they did see this pattern of behavior in terms of aggression and violence within a relationship. So, using aggression to regain control actually disrupted later identity verification because aggression in one year significantly reduced verification of spousal identity in the following year, which led to a spiral of more aggression in subsequent years. And so when we look at applications of this and um, the focus on identity theory or the application of identity theory in specifically the subfield of law, we see a big focus on like identity salience. So, identity theory has been used in this area Specifically, it has been used to explain the lapses in judgment of lawyers who, particularly those who defend corporate and government scandals without recognizing um, their biases, um, and their biases, particularly in defending these scandals. And so, lawyers, they noted that lawyers may have multiple identities that contribute to their judgments, whether they're good judgments or neutral or bad judgments. And when attorneys assume the identity of lawyer, it involves aggressively defending their clients, who may be, in this case, a corporation or government agency. However, attorneys may also have the identity of employee in that particular corporation or government agency, the ones that they're defending, that is. And so that may actually be more salient than the identity of lawyer, thereby influencing, biased judgments and behavior to protect the organization or agency that also financially supports them. Um, and they've done some interesting work in the subfield of sociology of education. So, a lot of this work has specifically focused on the influence of sex and gender and how they play a role in academic identity meanings and the meanings that are associated with particular academic identities. And so, an important aspect of identity formation are the meanings associated with these different identities. And so, by first understanding people's identities, we can then identify how interactions and perceptions can foster or discourage the formation of particular identities. So, for example, in STEM disciplines, women tend to be underrepresented. And in a study investigating high school students who attended summer programs designed to foster interest in STEM subjects, researchers used identity theory to explain perhaps one of the reasons why women are underrepresented in STEM fields, um, and how that might be addressed. So they found that um, females' perception of themselves um, was more, and so again, they touch on dimensions of gender, and they also focus on sex as a variable here. Um, so they found that often females perceive themselves as more feminine, um, and was more discrepant with how they perceived other science students. So they perceived the others as more masculine, whether or not they were male or female. And so females saw themselves more like other females, though, um, than other science students. So their identity, their sex identity, was more salient than their identity in science. And so, you have a room full of people, and they tended to identify, like, see themselves as more alike with um, other people they saw as female, instead of seeing themselves as more like those in science, even if they were also in science. The more salient identity for them was their sex identity. And so, what they found is that what actually fostered a STEM identity was attendance at, not just attendance at these STEM summer programs, but specifically experiencing emotionally satisfying relationships with others who are also involved in science activities. So, a strong, effective commitment being very important here. And that encouraged the salience of this um, science identity and engaging in STEM activities. And finally, this is a subfield in race and ethnicity, and typically it's just referred to as like sociology of race. But within that, there are specific focuses on race, um, and specific focuses on ethnicity. But ethnicity is typically nested under race, even though it is very much um, a separate, though often overlapping, um, area of interest. And so, an important development in identity theory is how identity processes operate across different racial groups and ethnicities, specifically social categories. So, again, more of a structural focus for identity theory specifically. The role of self esteem. So, It, as was mentioned, it tends to view race and ethnicity as these separate but sometimes overlapping social categories. And so they were looking at commitment to particular identities and salience of particular identities. And so researchers, um, again, wanted to examine the role of self esteem, commitment, and salience, particularly of the family identity, across different um, ethnicities. And so they found that the role of self esteem, commitment, or they investigated the role of self esteem, commitment, and salience of the family identity for African Americans, Latinos, and um, and whites as well. And so, um, commitment, both interactive and effective, influence the salience of the family identity, specifically for Latino Americans, whereas self esteem influenced the salience of the family identity for African Americans and white Americans. And so, again, they're looking at those differences in commitment and the motivation for for those identities and how it affects the salience of the family identity in particular. So moving on to social identity theory, which again, which again here identity refers to common identification with a collectivity or particular social category. And so, although it was developed primarily by psychological social psychologists, social identity theory has always had the potential to engage sociologists' interests. So, in the early formation of the theory, researchers drew heavily on sociological constructs to develop their ideas on how societal beliefs about the relationship between groups guide members of particular groups in pursuing a positive sense of distinctiveness for their own group and thus for themselves. And so, from this perspective, the social frame provided by intergroup beliefs influences whether people seek social mobility between groups, competition between their own group and another, or creative efforts to redefine social evaluation attached to their group. And these efforts, as you know, in turn, are affected by sociological factors such as intergroup permeability, status stability, and legitimacy. Um, and so here again, they're looking some of the focuses of social identity theory, recognizing that people behave in particular ways when they're a part of a group. Um, Both interpersonal and intergroup processes influence this individual behavior. And so, on the one hand, you have interpersonal behavior, which is behavior determined solely by the individual characteristics and interpersonal relationships that exist between the individual and others. And then you have intergroup behavior. So, that behavior determined solely by the social category membership that apply to um, more than two people. So, again, to people in a group. And so, going back to some of those motivations for social categorization and why that's important here in terms of applications and assumptions, as well as critiques, which we'll get to later on. So, a key assumption of social identity theory is that individuals are intrinsically motivated to achieve this positive distinctiveness. Um, Meaning that we are motivated to be different from others, and what makes us different makes us better because people want to associate themselves with more positive traits, and we do this for reasons of self enhancement and uncertainty reduction. So we tend to strive to maintain a positive self concept, and social categorization can facilitate this goal. We also see that social categorization makes us feel assured in our position and in our status. And again, these things aren't necessarily negative. They're not necessarily positive and they're not necessarily negative. Um, they're coming across in more of a value neutral way. So, especially for the motivation of uncertainty reduction, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It gives us um, order and stability. But of course, it can cause problems when we start looking at those intergroup dynamics. And so, some of the strategies that I wanted to cover that we haven't covered so far. Um, so again, thinking back to the motivations for social categorization, um, there are a variety of strategies that may be used for the purpose of like achieving this, positive distinctiveness in particular. Um, so what determines, which strategy people will employ is the perceived capacity for self enhancement or the capacity for that uncertainty reduction. So the perceived stability and legitimacy of this intra group status hierarchy. So what's occurring within the group, but also what the stability of status hierarchy across groups. So for individual mobility, um, this is referring to when individuals disassociate from the group and pursue their own goals designed to improve their personal benefit rather than the benefit of those within the group. And so this occurs when the individual perceives the group as not being conducive to their personal self enhancement. And then we have the social creativity strategy, which is when lower status group members try to increase their positive distinctiveness by comparing the in group to the out group on a new dimension. So it's kind of like nothing has really changed, but we're gonna start, I'm gonna start comparing us on this new thing. Um, like think about, which this is certainly not a perfect example for groups, but going back to the Mean Girls clip that you all watched, how Katie, might have just compared people. She said, kind of had a limited um, understanding of different parts of the body in terms of their value in American society. So in the United States, uh, the plastics kind of represented those views of body image and the different values attached to different parts of the body. Whereas Katie didn't necessarily know those things when she first, um, moved to the United States and became friends with him. And so by learning these new things, it's like she would be starting to compare people on these new dimensions that she didn't know about before. And so she can start making comparisons. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they suddenly exist or didn't exist before. But in terms of her social world, these are things that can be compared across groups and across individuals. So, again, social creativity, it's getting creative, it's thinking of new ways to make comparisons. Um, and so, when this occurs, it's the individual remaining within the group, but they have to be creative in order to gain some sort of self enhancement. And then finally, social competition, which tends to be the one that is focused on the most, um, which I think the other two honestly are just as, if not more, um, interesting. Maybe it's just because there isn't a big focus on individual mobility and social creativity strategies. Um, but for social competition, this is when an in group seeks positive distinctiveness through direct competition with the out group, and comparisons are on a dimension shared by both groups. So again, it's an existing thing, um, and we all have this characteristic, but we're just better at it. Like let's say you know like a basketball game, like you have two teams and we're all athletes here, but our team is just better than your team. So it's making these comparisons on an existing dimension. And so group ties, or the group tries to increase this positive distinctiveness from the relevant out group or relevant out groups. And so again, this doesn't really occur when there aren't out groups present. And sometimes there are out groups present, but they're not necessarily relevant or salient to the situation. So again, like if you're at a basketball game, a high school basketball game, there are out groups there. Like, I would assume everyone on the team is around the same age. Well, they have their parents there who are part of a totally different generation. That's an out group. But it's not really relevant to the situation or to the competition, and it wouldn't be productive to be making these comparisons. So, some of the common research applications. Um, and so, although social identity theory um, has engaged core interests of sociological social psychology, such as the relationships between groups, self identity, and social behavior, social identity theory has remained relatively isolated from sociological social psychology. Um, and ironically, the reasons for this are probably related to, um, this process, the very process that social identity theory describes, which is intergroup competition. And so, since social identity theory, its origins um, are in an interest in the cognitive aspects of prejudice that emerged, or in terms of research that came about in the 1960s, this particular interest. Social identity theory has developed into a more of a general theoretical perspective on the collective self and on group and intergroup processes. And so here I listed some of the related areas of research. There's quite a few. If some of these pique your interest, I highly recommend doing more research and seeing how they can enhance your understanding of the world, or they can enhance your work in some way, because there are certainly quite a few. And some additional examples are a specific interest in intergroup relations, group processes, social cognition, and specifically social identity work on crowd behavior, collective protest, political rhetoric, delinquency, adolescence, youth, diversity, and system justification beliefs. So there's quite a few sub areas um, in terms of how this has been applied and where this has been applied. But again, kind of, and this goes to a critique, and there's we're going to get into into the main critiques of these in a moment. But one of the big critiques for social identity theory is that it focuses too heavily on competition, and that's what really keeps it isolated from sociological social psychology, where it's more of a focus um, in psychological social psychology. So, everyday applications, and this is for both identity theory and social identity theory. Just kind of an overall, here's how you could incorporate some of these things um, into your life. Um, so, no one is immune from the influence of, the people and the groups that we encounter. And although we're unique individuals, much of who we are is informed by the social world, because we use others around us as a reference point for much of our attitudes and behaviors. And we do this because we're social creatures. And so, knowing how groups influence people can help you to enhance your personal and professional toolkit, um, so that you can better engage with those with whom you're working or serving. And it can also increase your capacity for helping others, or your capacity for high performance. And you can do this by incorporating some of these strategies, demonstrating your deeper knowledge and understanding of the social world and of social influence in your work. So, as we discussed in the beginning of this section, the origins of identity theory and social identity theory um, lie in symbolic interaction, and an interest in how and why individuals act, not as individuals, but as members of the groups with which they identify. So, one common example is how people identify with different political parties and tend to vote accordingly. Often there's just so much conflicting information in the world that people, really struggle to remain well informed on all the issues and all the candidates, particularly when you're looking across a local, state, and federal level. There's just so much. And so, because of this, they, tend to vote predominantly down party lines. simply because they identify with the values, um, maybe not entirely, but to some extent. And again, there you could look at identity salience and what means more to them, and why they might, you know, vote for particular vote certain ways on particular issues. But they do this because they identify with, at least some of the values and beliefs of a particular party. But in more extreme circumstances, you see straight line voting, which is like people just checking the box, like straight line, Democrat or straight line Republican, or you see that cluster in these more extreme situations, and that's often in elections on local, state, federal levels, where there's a strong focus on group competition or at least perceived competition. And so, when the nature of the group relations fosters these kinds of perceptions, one implication of identifying with a particular group is that the closer individuals feel to the group, so they're in group, the more uniform their behavior will be. So, again, they're more likely to conform to particular ways of acting and thinking and behaving. And the more likely they will view members of the outgroup as stereotypes. And this goes for both sides. This isn't just one side is stereotyping the other. Both sides are stereotyping each other, and they're both conforming to the values and norms of their own particular in groups. And you see this being more and more evident in situations where this perceived conflict, um, this conflict, real or perceived, is it's really at that you know the top of our awareness or the forefront of our awareness. And so this means that when things are particularly contentious, people tend to um, really really conform with their in groups, and really stereotype out groups. They tend to have a more stereotyping, caricatured perception of the other group, which, kind of going back to one of the applications of social identity theory, or I believe it was social identity theory, but it kind of created um, this cycle of conflict, to where that just created more and more conflict um, as the process continued. So when things are less contentious, so let's say take for example like computer sales. So Apple users may see themselves as being kind of cool and edgy and hip, because Mac products are marketed and perceived that way, and thus they see themselves as having these traits as well. And perhaps they see Windows users as being more serious, uptight, and even a bit behind the times, um, less creative. And this is part of the marketing strategy. Apple knows how identity works. They know their customers will believe these associations to be true and associate those things with themselves. So use it to stereotype themselves, and others according to these perceptions. So Apple used identity theories in an attempt to cultivate an attitude towards its product that would lead to certain behavior. So in this case, purchasing their products. So again, because like our affiliation with particular identities, our understanding of those identities in relation to others influences behavior and the meaning we associate to things. And so these examples might give you some ideas for how you could incorporate some of the tenets of identity theory and social identity theory into your own work, because ultimately it is to influence others, at least for what many of you, I would say the vast majority of you, want to do, whether you want to be in social work, counseling, law, or criminal justice. A lot of you are you work in design in some way, shape, or form. And so, in many ways, we would all be working to influence people, hopefully for the better. And so some of the examples I was thinking of in terms of everyday application, is one in social work, and the importance of understanding self perception, um, in regards to behavior and in group affiliation, in regards to your ability to communicate effectively with different people. So there's been a lot of work, research and social work on how, um, like particularly with caseworkers, um, but for other areas in social work as well. But that when you're working with people, particularly like caseworkers working with um, parents and families and children, you see more effective communication and better results when they perceive you um, as being not only a part of their in group, which fosters more effective communication, more productive communication, tends to reduce conflict and perceptions of judgment, at least from, you know, from outside groups. You're seen as being, affiliated within the same in group, but also understanding self perception and behavior. And so personal and um, someone's personal um, identities and their role identities as well, and how they might perform those in relation to their immediate context. So, how they're defining the situation, but also how they're performing those in relation to you, and how understanding these things can help you to foster more productive, more positive interactions um, with people in different environments and within your capacity as um, a social worker. And counseling, again, self perception being a big one. One of the major uh, examples I thought of here was in terms of identity verification, and how someone is not only performing their identity, but how they are responding to people when their identities are either being, verified or not verified. And the types of strategies they use to gain that identity verification, the types of conflicts they're experiencing, maybe because those identities aren't being verified, and they can't think of, effective strategies to get that identity verification. Um, and of course, you can also, it doesn't have to be solely focused on identity theory. Social identity theory is also very important, and, how people behave in terms of groups, um, but also from an identity theory perspective, the type of commitment to different identities, the salience of those identities, um, but also like, the structural, um, the ways in which these, like, let's say, like operating within particular institutions, shapes and constrains people's ability to invoke particular identities, um, and how that influences self perception and the ways in which people are able to operate in their social world. For law and criminal justice, intergroup relations being a big one here, as well as identity salience. So, understanding how people are behaving and how they're perceiving you in different situations, and understanding where they're coming from, and maybe what their most salient identity is in that particular um, situation. So, again, I think here it would be not just beneficial for understanding, other people's motivations and behaviors, but understanding how they're perceiving you in different situations, and how um, you can alter your behavior in such a way that, reduces conflict, or um, reduces, you know reduces conflict, but also reduces competition in terms of like salient out groups. um, Maybe how do you uh, perform your identity in ways um, that will signify that you're not a member of, a particularly relevant out group, depending on the situation. So lots of different things to think about there in law and criminal justice, which again is a very, very broad area. So I don't want to get too specific. And then in design, some of the examples I was thinking of would be like this in group affiliation, competition, and differentiation. So, maybe seeing the ways in which you can capitalize on in group thinking by showing who else uses your product, or operates in these particular environments. Again, depending on what it is that what area of design you're in. But yeah, thinking about the ways in which you can, capitalize on or emphasize this in-group thinking and these in-group processes. Um, and venues for um, people to, maybe it's to discuss your product or discuss other issues, but the ways in which you can design the physical world to best facilitate these social interactions for the better. And, maybe in some ways you want to create competition, maybe healthy competition, um, by showing how maybe using your product, for example, would differentiate in group members from those they consider out groups. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, um, let's say, I'm just thinking of like, I don't know, like on Facebook, you have like, I don't even remember what it's called, like top fans or something. Or you rank users in terms of their score for like certain games. So that's not necessarily like a bad thing, but it's a way to differentiate yourself from others um, within that group and gain some sort of status within the group. But also, within design, you can ask questions like, when coming up with the concept, in particular, you can ask questions like, what common experiences do maybe users of your product share, or people who are going to be operating in this particular environment share? What are their common experiences, their common identities? How are they connected to one another, and how could they be connected to one another? And how can maybe how you design this particular space facilitate those interactions and those connections, or maybe even mirror those connections and interactions in some conceptual way. And are there drastic differences in lifestyles between the intended audience? And also, how do you communicate effectively with your user base or with your audience, that so that they feel that members of their in group would perhaps use this product or operate within this particular environment, or whatever the case may be. So you can think in terms of in groups and out groups, and how you can facilitate different interactions in ways that will reduce conflict, um, or increase sociability, whatever the case may be. But thinking in terms of identity theory and social identity theory, and how they can be applied in the everyday but also in your professional life. So finally, some of the main critiques, particularly of social identity theory. Identity theory tends to be more well integrated into social psychology. um, Social identity theory, um, again, is pretty isolated, although there are some attempts to bring it in more to sociological social psychology. But the first critique is on the self esteem hypothesis. And so, again, that states that intergroup discrimination tends to elevate self esteem, and this threatened self esteem promotes intergroup discrimination. Um, but what they found is that this tends to conflate social identity with personal identity, and it also disregards the other mechanisms for maintaining a positive self concept that already exist, that are already present in the theories, or in the theory itself. That's like strategies like individual mobility and social creativity. So again, there's this huge focus on competition and self-esteem, and positive regard and all of that. But it was kind of like an add-on to social identity theory. And again, tends to conflate social identity with personal um, identity. And then finally, the one of the biggest critiques of social identity theory um, is that although it's very consistent, so it has high explanatory power, it tends to be very inconsistent with its predictive power. So that means that it's really good at explaining results after the fact. Like, basically it's retrospective. It's really great in retrospect. So you take an instance from, it doesn't even have, when I say history, I mean it could have happened yesterday. But take any event where this would be relevant. It's really good at explaining the outcomes and the interactions and the processes, but it's not really great at predicting outcomes. It's not well suited for predicting outcomes. And so, although this tends to be one of the biggest critiques of social identity theory, um, I think in a lot of ways, I mean, of course, it is a fair critique, but at the same time, um, social identity theory, I would say some use it as a way to predict. They claim that it can predict behavior. But as long as you're not claiming that um, its utility is in predicting behavior, then I think it's still a good tool for examining things retrospectively. And perhaps there's something um, that could be developed um, and more finely tuned um, to address, that particular issue of predicting these behavioral outcomes. But social identity theory just isn't well suited for that, at least in its current stage of development. And so that's it. Make sure to complete quiz 3 and complete the reading for this week and watch the supplementary videos. Thanks.